Are colleagues content with the minutes of the 8th of January meeting? Yes, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Just wanted to raise one issue on item 5, and it's regarding the Castlefield corridor. And Mayor Rotherham asked that the proposed changes be assessed by agreed objective criteria and evidence, and I just wondered whether they had been shared, and if they hadn't, could they be shared, please, with this committee?
Is David Hogarth here? David, do you want to say something in response to that?
We've got a working group that is working through the detail of the changes. In fact, that's meeting next week. It's a group of the Rail North Committee, and that has been using available evidence to scrutinise the industry's plans and proposals. So I'm sure we can share the material from the previous working group and the upcoming one with members who wish to see that. No problem.
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
As you know, we meet in public, and we meet in public on as many items as we possibly can, and we restrict the number of items where we feel the need for confidentiality reasons to meet in closed session. We were originally proposing that would involve items 5, 6, 7 and 8 today. As you've seen, we have managed to look at item 8, that we will be able to hold item 8 in public, which is very, very good. So I'm asking for the authority of the board to resolve that the public be asked to leave simply for items 5, 6 and 7. And then I think in an hour's time, about an hour's time, we will welcome those individuals back. So please go and have a cup of coffee and we'll see you back in an hour if that has the support of the board. So I'm going to put that motion to the board that 5, 6 and 7 for confidentiality reasons need, in the Chief Executive's judgment, to be held in private. We so agreed. Thank you very much. Could I then ask members of the public to leave us, and we will call you back as soon as it is possible to do so. And thank you for your patience. Thank you. North, and we are considering the report of the Strategy Director, and I'm delighted. I think this is your first session in front of the board, is it not?
Yes.
So David Hughes, the new Strategy Director of TfN, is responsible for this paper. Welcome, David. You can see what fun it is already. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. We've already discussed High Speed North in the previous agenda items to a degree, so I'll keep my opening remarks short because I'm sure there'll be quite a bit of discussion. I think the paper's self-explanatory. It provides an update on developments since the Prime Minister's announcement on the 11th of February on the outcome of the Oakerview review of High Speed 2, and clearly the outcome of the Oakerview review is a very positive one for the North, with the government's commitment to the eastern and western legs of High Speed 2. The assessment, not the review, the assessment of High Speed 2 Phase 2B and the development of an integrated rail plan, we think provide an opportunity to develop a coherent pipeline of long-term rail investment for the North, and potentially to accelerate some of that investment. The paper sets out in section 4 in particular the priorities and principles which we think should, from the North's perspective, be driving the assessment process and the development of an integrated rail point. And a starting point in those principles is that there should be a very meaningful role for the TfN board through the auspices of TfN to help steer the assessment process and the development of the integrated rail plan. So we are keen to be able to articulate clear priorities to government, and with that in mind, the recommendation in the paper is that members endorse the priorities and principles that are set out in sections 4 and 5 in particular, and TfN's intent that those priorities and principles be communicated to government as statutory advice.
Thank you, David. And just for ease of discussion, can I remind you we're working on the High Speed North paper, which is the white paper, not the green paper. The green paper was when it had to be a closed session. Now we're able to do it as public session. We're working off the white paper. So can I invite comments? I'm going to come to Darren first.
Perhaps I'm going to sound a bit simple here, but this is sort of exercising my thoughts on this paper. Was, as you describe it, what is the status of HS2B then? Is it going to be part of, is it not part of HS2? And is it therefore part of NPR? And so what's its status? Because the paper gives a view that it's not, might be not governed by HS2. So what is its status? Because there's one of the sort of concerns that we would have is that it's not just being used, is it, as a way of obviously reducing the costs of HS2, because obviously any overshoot on HS2B would sit somewhere else. So I wouldn't want it to detract from the overall spending cake of NPR, unless they're going to increase the overall spending cake of NPR. Does that make any sense at all?
No.
Right.
David, do you want to nail that one?
Well, I'll try, but Nick may want to come in as well. So, as we understand it, the reference in the paper reflects our understanding of the announcement made by the Prime Minister on the 11th of Feb, that in terms of the delivery bodies for High Speed 2 Phase 2B, those delivery what the best delivery body might be is something that will be considered as part of the assessment. But the implication was that there may well be a new delivery body for High Speed 2 Phase 2B. Now, we've not read that to be in any way putting in question the government's commitment to commitment to Phase 2B. It's more a question of what the best means are of delivering that, and in considering what delivery body might be best put in place to deliver Phase 2B. An important aspect of that is what governance arrangements would be put around it. But I think this is more a question of the how rather than the what, if I can put it that way.
Nick, can you clarify on this?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think two things. One is the integrated rail plan in terms of reference make clear that the questions around delivery body and governance are part of that work. So we'll come to conclusions on that towards the end of the year. The other thing that ministers have made clear is that given the scale of the job that HS2 Limited has got to do, the sheer scale of this project, that they are looking to focus the company more on phase 1 and 2A, and they are looking at alternative arrangements for both 2B and Euston as standalone mega projects in their own right. Clearly, the integration with NPR is one of the other things that would have to be considered in that mix, but in the meantime, to the technical expertise for actually doing anything on 2B sits in Tim's team.
So, Darren, it's about delivery. Yeah. Michael.
Thanks, Chairman. Can I thank David for the report? And in Lancashire, we certainly welcome the Orkavy review and the government's decision to proceed with HS2 for all the clear reasons which have been set out previously. There's reference in the report to actually the connections of HS2 to the wider network, specifically to Liverpool and to Lancashire and on to Cumbria and Scotland. But there doesn't appear to be any explicit commitment to the continuation of the Goulburn link, which is critical for Lancashire if we are to maximise the benefits of HS2. Lancashire has one of the biggest economies in the north of England, and certainly in the northwest of England. I think I'm correct in saying this is second only to Greater Manchester. So there are clear benefits there which need to be maximised, and we feel that the only way of doing that is via the Goulburn link, and of course giving those benefits to our friends to the north in Cumbria and Scotland as well. Taking away the Goulburn link would have an impact obviously on speed. And you could almost probably get from London to Crewe quicker than you could get from Crewe to Preston, which is simply perverse. I would submit when you think of the distances that are being covered there. But importantly, besides speed, it would have a massive impact upon capacity. And there are issues over the capacity, and removing the Goulburn link, we submit, would remove the number of routes that will be available to trade, and it's trade which is critically important in terms of taking the economy forward. We also feel that without that link in place, there will be significant delay potentially on the network to the south of Lancashire, but that would have an impact for any trains travelling southwards as well. It would import delay onto the HS2 network, which would cause significant problems further south as well, and unreliability of the network. So for all those reasons, we feel clearly that the Goulburn link should be continued, and we'll look for support around the table, please.
Yes, I think for Warrington's point of view, the Goulburn link actually cuts Warrington out of the network altogether, so we couldn't support that on the basis that would be detrimental to Warrington's interests.
Thank you, Chair. I just wonder whether, if we're talking about principles on which we go forward, whether it would be helpful to start to talk about HS2 and NPR as equals, as opposed to where we've been before, which is that HS2 has always been the big brother, and NPR has been struggling to sort of make itself heard alongside it, and it's never been quite as kind of fully formed. I think it would be much more helpful if we were quite clear as a board that in our minds these two are equal priorities, and that we are seeking to get the right solution for both, rather than sort of work. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, Section 4 is still written as though HS2 is the main show in town, and we're kind of fitting in around it. And I think that takes us back to the discussion we had on Richard's review. So I would certainly welcome it if it was kind of pitched more in the sense of, the North needs both of these schemes are equally important. Integrating them as one makes a lot of sense. And obviously then from that, I just would like further clarification of, given what we've agreed on Richard George's report today, how does that get communicated to the new High Speed North for them to operationalise what this board has just agreed around the comparison of the options for Piccadilly?
So I just Liverpool City Region, unfortunately, Mayor Rotham couldn't make today, and Liam Robinson, his deputy, unfortunately is ill and can't be here either. But they did write with a comment just asking for both Liverpool's still feel they've been omitted from the high-speed networks. We wanted at that point to be sort of recorded, but also the importance of freight in looking at the integrated rail plan as well. So I think that was just 2 points that Liverpool City Region asked for sharing today. So,
David, do you want to come back, and particularly could you say something about Goulburn Junction and where it figures in the plan?
So we very deliberately in the paper sought to identify, probably not exhaustively, the known issues of scope that we think we will have to address in providing our input into the integrated rail plan. What we didn't seek to do is take a position on those issues. We merely sought to identify what we thought the most obvious ones were that we would need to address, and to that list we need to. Well, I think the paper references Piccadilly, but we need to reflect in our work programme for the integrated rail plan the outcome of the earlier discussion around Richard's report. So I think very much the next phase that we envisage getting into is working with members to start thrashing out some of the positions on these known scope issues, one of which is clearly the Goulburn link. But as I say, it wasn't the intent of the paper to start trying to identify any solution in respect to those scope issues, merely to list what the kind of issues that we felt we would need to be addressing in the course of our work on the integrated rail plan. And I very much take the point from yourself, Andy, around the equality of treatment between MPR and High Speed 2, and I think that is worth thinking how we factor that into the principles as we shape those for our statutory advice to government.
So the principles in part derive from a board call on the 25th of February. So there's already been board input, particularly into paragraph 4, 4.2. Those points came up. I'm hearing 3 things that we're being asked to do. First is to change the way we describe those principles to provide for equality of status between HS2 and NPR in the integrated rail plan. That's a proposal from Andy. I think that does reflect the conversations we've had around this table, so I'm going to put that to the board as to whether that would meet with general agreement, that in our language we should seek to ensure the integrated rail plan treats the two equally. Because we could do that with some tonal changes. So we agreed on that, so we'll bank that one. I think on Andy's second point, clearly we didn't want in preparing this paper, Andy, to preempt the earlier discussion statement that's blindingly obvious. We will now build in the agreement we have, and that will be a principal ask from TfN as a board decision for the assessment that is being undertaken. And of course we have our own work, which Nick referred to, the peer group review, so we're furnishing our own view to input to it. So we'll bank that. I then come to the very important question of Goulburn Junction, and David has made the point that we weren't seeking to be quite that specific today, but actually, allow me, David, even more important than that, I've heard 2 voices on this issue. Even since you've raised it, Michael, there was another view. So I would say we need to tackle this, but we need to take it offline. I don't think it's something that we can conclude. It was not intended to be concluded today. But Michael, you have my assurance we will address this issue, and we will seek to build a consensus view across the different representative groups, local authority and LEP, on the board. But it's clear to me already that I couldn't do what I did with Andy's issue, which is put it to you for agreement today if I'm hearing 2 voices. Is that acceptable, Michael? Okay, we'll do that then. On that basis, I'm looking at paragraph 8.1. We're agreeing the principles in paragraph 4, which was the members' meeting, and then David's points in paragraph 5 as our input to the High Speed North assessment. Are we agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Move on to NPR governance. This is a very important technical issue which the Chief Executive has brought to us of an amended Memorandum of Understanding to make sure we are very transparent and clear. And I think, Barry, you initially are just going to comment on this according to my brief.
Thank you, John. So the the paper sets out at a high level some background in terms of the joint or co-sponsorship of the NPR programme. So the programme board that oversees the development of the NPR programme is a joint board between ourselves and the Department for Transport. The MOU, so Memorandum of Understanding that we have circulated, summarises that working relationship. This has been looked at by the internal auditors as in terms of an issue that was raised at Audit and Governance. I think Ian was the Audit and Governance Committee, and something we were looking at already in terms of updating the existing MOU. The thing I probably want to stress in this working arrangement is I would describe the working arrangement as actually, in terms of joint work in the department, as very positive. But when it comes to the funding of particular pieces of work, the department, as the sort of controller of the budget, makes the ultimate decision on what work goes ahead or not. It is not very often we have disagreements about that, but nevertheless, the decisions on commissioning work are a matter that is reserved for final approval by the department as part of these working arrangements. That is the status quo. Clearly, much of our work in the Northern Transport Charter is seeking greater devolved powers, but what we are asking today is that the board approve us entering into the updated Memorandum of Understanding.
Anybody have any questions on this? Okay, so yes, please.
Just in terms of the previous paper and resolutions, is there anything in the governance that could be used to sort of enhance the position of TFN in making its case and getting its voice heard?
Very good question. Thank you for that. Barry?
So I think I would separate the two things out. So Tim Wood, who runs the NPR programme and reports in effect to that joint board, when taking High Speed North forward, because of taking partly work on the general rail network and NPR and HS2 Phase 2B, that work for High Speed North is going to be led by David Hughes, because it's more a strategic part within TFN rather than specifically just NPR. So I think I would keep them sort of separate in that sense, and what we really want to do with Northern Powerhouse Rail is keep the progress going so we can feed in the right evidence into any work that's being done by John Armitt or by the Infrastructure and Projects Authority looking at market capacity, so that we can keep progress. I think more than anything else, I want to be in a position to push ideas forward to government for making faster progress to up the ante in terms of, we have a government that I think is very much indicating a willingness to commit investment to the north. So let's actually give them the opportunity to do so.
So, John, a detailed but important point. The paper attached to this refers to the Network Rail role as an infrastructure development role, but there is also an important point, and bearing in mind both the long discussions we had in Oakervie and the recent experience with Crossrail in the south, actually there's a role for Network Rail in integrating the services into the existing network. And I think it's important that when all this lot is talked about, there's always a reference to how this fits into the existing railway network. That's been part of the development problem of all these things thus far, so we should make sure that that gets referred to.
Thank you. Paragraph 3.1, I'm asking for your agreement to the Memorandum of Understanding as a statement of the record, with the addition of Peter Hendy's very valid point about the role of Network Rail. Is it so agreed? Agreed. Item 10. You'll recall at the last meeting we had an innovation from the executive team of providing us with a monthly operating report so that we had the background information on what the organisation was doing, and we could note that without always needing extra separate papers and discussion. So, Ian, you're joining Barry for this item, aren't you?
I was
taking
going
it together.
to take it, John.
We're going to take the report as noted, but Ian and Barry are available if you want to ask any questions on the monthly operating report. Are there any questions, or are you just taking it for note? It's a very full and comprehensive document.
And I would just say from the Audit Assurance Committee that we thought this was an excellent document to bring forward and share it with all members, so I'm happy to promote it.
Always happy to accept plaudits. I think you've satisfied people. That's good. It's a good innovation, a useful document for us to have. Report. So I now move to item 11, which is the business plan. And I think, Barry, you're going to say a few words about this. And then again, Barry and Ian, who've been responsible for this, will take any questions.
Thank you, John. The business plan was brought to Partnership Board and outline in January this year. Since then, it's been taken to Executive Board and to the Scrutiny Committee in February. And what the business plan sets out, I think, is a very ambitious and fast-moving year ahead. I think in entering this year, we're entering with much greater momentum behind investment in infrastructure in general in the UK and investment in infrastructure in the North in particular with greater momentum. The priority this year is the integrated rail plan. I think there's much opportunity for the North. That's one of our key priorities. But we are going to be doing a lot of work on decarbonisation this year, and we'll come on to decarbonisation later on in the agenda. But this is the year in which the Department for Transport will map out a national strategy for decarbonisation of the transport network. Transport continues to be a major issue for the environment, and our input to that and shaping of that agenda, I think, is absolutely key. And we very much welcomed the move to bring forward the introduction of electric vehicles, something we called for in the Strategic Transport Plan. And the more we can do to help shape that strategy this year, I think, is absolutely key. Just talking about roads, we had the announcement of the investment strategy for roads, RIS2, yesterday. And one of the key activities in the year ahead will be shaping and starting to shape the development opportunities for Roads Investment Strategy 3, because the lead-in time for roads is always quite long, and therefore helping to shape that against that background of decarbonisation is absolutely key this year as well. And we were pleased to see the A66 was one of the projects featured. I'm looking at Keith now because it's clearly important, not just to those direct areas affected by it, but actually, I think as the RIS2 document rightly said, if you are an exporter from Belfast, which is actually where I'm from originally, wanting to get into Europe, the A66 is an incredibly important road for those people wanting to export to Europe from Northern Ireland as well. So a critical bit, and we're very pleased to see that in RIS2 yesterday. So, but preparing for RIS3 and those priorities will be a part of the year ahead. Rail will continue to be a very significant area. We await the Williams Review publication. We are hearing different dates about when that might come out, but anything would be speculation, I suspect, until we know more. And the Blake-Jones implementation is a key activity this year. So I think a lot can change in rail, and we enter this year. Again, I have to mention coronavirus. I think there is, a lot, I think, in terms of the year ahead that will require fast movement and responsiveness in the rail, in the area of both rail operations and rail investment. And the final bit I'd like to highlight in the business plan is this year we'll see the spending review, which is critical, and our input to the spending review, but also we'll see the government publish the National Infrastructure Strategy. So in terms of getting a wider commitment and a longer term commitment to Northern Powerhouse Rail, the stronger we are, the more nimble we are, and the more in the front foot we are around Northern Powerhouse Rail, around our wider investment programme, then I think there's much to play for in the year ahead. So the business plan is there as a draft Word document. We will be then getting that set in a graphic fashion, but we've given some illustration what that could look like. I'll pause there, and either Ian and I between us will answer any questions.
Any questions on the business plan? And then I will, Jim, come to you in a moment, if I may, because I thought you might like to say something about RIS2 in the north, if you wish to, not if you don't wish to. But first of all, let's just do the governance bit of the business plan. You may have noted that my chairman's forward is in Latin. This is quite deliberate. That was a joke. I've forgotten more Latin than I ever learned. Through the governance process, yes. Great.
Thank you. It wasn't a question, it was a comment really on section 31 and 32 on integrated and smart travel, which I raised at our previous meeting. The IST programme is a flagship project for Transport for the North, but one which largely ignores the needs of the non-metropolitan areas that are represented around the table. So a question first of all, what is the plan B for the non-metropolitan areas? Secondly, a plea that the business plan draft can be modified to enable work to be done to show that the concerns and needs of the non-metropolitan areas are going to be addressed. And finally, to save myself having to repeat under the next agenda item, the budget, could an allocation be made to show that the needs of the non-metropolitan areas are being taken seriously?
Great, thank you for that. Just for clarity, on your second and third point, do you mean in relation to IST, or do you then mean more generally?
I mean in specific relation to IST.
Thank you.
So, in integrated smart travel, the bus or the fares tool and the disruption messaging tool is available to all. Any local transport authority can adopt the disruption tool, and the fares tool, which will be nationally available on an open source data hub, again will actually provide information on all, again, it'll be open to all operators to use it. So from that point of view, these are sort of widely used or available widely. In terms of phase 3, which is Contact Us on Rail, that is something that will depend on ideally on a national rollout, which we're waiting for the Williams review to look at from that point of view. If not, we would then look to do that in the north, and that would be rolled out in pay-as-you-go areas, which would be quite extensive, but they would be pay-as-you-go areas where it's limited by the fares envelope rather than anything else. But that would allow people to pay either £10 or £30 for, depending on the agreement with the credit card companies or the debit card companies to allow journeys to be made within a pay-as-you-go area, which can actually be quite widespread across the north. And the final bit, which is, I think, the bit, Craig, you're probably most interested in, which is the phase 4 bit, which is looking at how we support local projects. There's no allocation has been made yet in terms of budget, so we wouldn't allocate specific bits that way. What we're looking at is saying, we're out talking to a lot of authorities from all around the north, saying, what ideas do you have, so that we can actually start putting proposals back to the Department for Transport about how we allocate that funding, because that's the next step. But we need to do that discussion with local transport authorities first, and I will make sure we have those discussions with your authority.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the paragraph on the Rail North Partnership, and there's no reflection of all of the discussions we've been having about the change in relationship with the Rail North Committee. It doesn't talk about the Rail North Committee. I just wonder if there's
Blake Jones' recommendation.
yes. Yeah. I would have thought there should be something in this about that we are looking at that relationship.
What's the target audience for this business plan? Because most business plans get produced and sit on a shelf and never get read. And therefore, if we are to get this message out to as wide an audience as possible, can I make a plea that we have some sort of really succinct executive summary, which at least stands the chance of being read, rather than the 31 pages of supporting information, which probably, depending on the target audience, won't get an audience.
I think we need Gracie to do a short video for us, because she got the message across on the strategic plan better than any of the rest of us. But your point's well made.
Many people ask me, what does Transport for the North do? People in business locally, because you're very good on strategy and you're developing all the plans, but we want some quick wins. And I just wonder whether this business plan should say that TFM will support quick win projects as and when they arise, if they fit within the general framework of what we're trying to achieve, because it does give a very positive message back to business then.
So, if we take those in turn, Judith, yes, we should add something in about that relationship, and if I will, in finalising this document after today, I'll add something in that reflects that. Yes, we should do a short executive summary that is clear and easily read by those who are not transport people. I think that's probably a critical bit, so just very plain. I think we are able to support quick wins. Whenever DFT have ever said actually there's a funding round here for the major road network or any sort of elements like that, we've actually been able to respond incredibly quickly, Peter, and we will continue to do that. I don't think I would express it necessarily in the business plan, but I will give you that reassurance that we will continue to do that.
I certainly think, Barry, if it's not in the business plan, it would be worth just the comms team, if I may be this bold, just circulating a note to the board on one or two of those quick wins in each of our principal areas of operation. Smart rail, local rail schemes, major road network, local road schemes, because we have such a collection, but it's a classic question that you suddenly presented with. So what have you actually done in the last few months? And we've got a plan costing 70 billion for 30 years, doesn't cut it. What they want to know is, have we done anything about Southport or Darlington in this period? It'd be useful just to have that ammunition, because I know we have. On that basis, is the business plan approved, and can we delegate to the Chief Executive just to make the final wordsmithing work? Thank you very much. We've been good boys and girls today. We are unprecedentedly ahead of schedule. So I'm going to propose we have a 10-minute comfort break, get a cup of coffee, and reconvene at 2:10. Oh, we haven't done the budget. I've got one ahead of myself. And here. Okay. We'll do the budget and then we'll have a 10-minute comfort break. Ian, I've stolen your moment of glory on approval of the budget for 2020-2021.
Thank you, Chair. As people will be able to see, this budget flows directly from the business plan that we've just been talking about in the previous report. The gross budget for the year for 2021 is 88.1 million, inclusive of contingencies. The net budget against which we'll actually monitor TFM's performance is with those contingencies extracted, which is 65.8. The budget's fully funded from grants, contributions, contracted income and brought forward reserves, as is set out in the report. The main movements on the prior year relate to two things, principally. One is a near doubling of MPR activity to circa £60 million. The bulk of that, around 43 million, has been identified as a specific activity to be delivered. There's a contingency amount within that sum for another 17 million. But there has been a corresponding drop, or a offsetting drop, in the expenditure on the IST programme compared to last year's budget, principally due to the decision that was made to discontinue phase 3 at the last board meeting, which has resulted in a fall of about 75% on the budget for last year. As previously noted, some of the elements of TFN's expenditure are dependent on in-year approvals from the department, principally on MPR, which is, as was picked up in previous items, is approved on a line-by-line basis. Also, though, in relation to phases 3 and 4 of the IST programme, where we have some funding commitment and approval from the department to proceed with development, but we will need to take a revised strategic outline case to the department in order to get more funding approvals over the course of the year. This report also sets out a reserve strategy that TFN intends to adopt, and it also represents the Treasury Management Strategy for approval. That Treasury Management Strategy should be familiar to people. It's only very marginally amended from the previous version that was approved last year, and it should be familiar to members from their own organisations. It's probably best if I stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Ian. Questions for Ian? I think the variances in the budget are well understood around the board table, as you say, enhancing the NPR work and pulling back in the capital sense on the IST work at this moment, what we call a pause. That's why it's changed. Judith.
Just with reference to the IST work, have we made any progress with commissioning some of the sub-regions in terms of pilots? So just would be good to get some sense of progress on that.
We've made progress in identifying and to having those discussions about what type of schemes we might be able to take forward, but no decision's been made yet. We'll have to bring those back to the board, Judith, at a future date. But yes, those discussions are very active, and just to reassure Craig, I've had an email from a colleague while I was setting up a meeting, making sure we do set up a meeting with Cheshire East. But yes, those discussions are ongoing, and we will be coming back with some proposals around which one should be taken forward as a pilot, yes.
Say anything about yesterday's very impressive package of RIS2 proposals?
Certainly, just let me find the note. That's what I'll be able to find it all. Sorry, 2 seconds. Yes, it's gone. Your budget. Okay. So, I mean, the first thing is that in the round, the RIS that we've been working on for the last 18 months of 25.3 billion was approved, and there was an extra 2.1 billion added to make up the PFI funds for the Lower Thames Crossing and the A303 tunnel, which is quite important because it means that we didn't have to go back to the schemes that were being proposed in order to fund those projects. So, in sort of summary, in the north there were 2 new schemes committed. The first is the A66, which I think has been well broadcast before, and then secondly the Simister Island Northwest Quadrant improvements on the around Manchester. The 13 RIS1 schemes that we had started are funded for completion during RIS2, so they will all be done. And there are 3 smart motorways, the M62 junctions 20 to 25, the M6 junctions 21A to 26, and the M56 junctions 6 to 8. Now, we also got the Smart Motorway Safety Stocktake published this morning, and it includes about £600 million worth of retrospective safety improvements. The 2 major ones are the fitment of radar stopped vehicle detection, the removal during the course of the next 5 years of the schemes which have the dynamic hard shoulder. So those are the schemes where the hard shoulder is used either some parts of the day as a hard shoulder and some parts of the day as a running lane. And they are going to be converted before the end of RIS 2 such that that running lane is permanent, so that people are no longer confused about whether it's a hard shoulder or a running lane. So, and the funding for those changes has to be found from within the existing RIS programme. The RIS talks about maybe cancelling some schemes in order to fund that. We don't think that's going to be necessary. We do think there'll be some rephasing. Potentially these 3 schemes may be affected, so there may be some rephasing or delay to those schemes, but there will be no smart motorway cancellations as a result. And then there are 9 further schemes which we will be developing during RIS 2 and hoping to construct during RIS 3 and or RIS 4. So they're the A19 north of Newcastle junctions, the A64 Hop Grove, the M1 Leeds Eastern Gateway, the M1 M62 Lofthouse Interchange, the M6 junctions 19 to 21A, that's Knutsford to Croft for extra capacity, the M1 junctions 35A to 39, the A1 Doncaster to Dorrington, the M6 at junction 22, and there's some southeast junctions, the Manchester Southeast Junction improvements. In top of that, we've had all of the renewals and all of the maintenance funding for the north of England, as well as the other regions, approved.
Thank you very much. I thought, given that was hot off the press, colleagues would be interested. There's a lot of activity there across the north, and quite a lot of those, Jim, are priorities that this board had recommended to you.
Yeah, actually they all are. I think there were 15 priorities out of the board, and we've managed to get funding for 7.
News. Any questions for Jim?
Yes, I mean, we have we've been going for 5 years now. We've got a pretty good track record of delivery. Not everything is on time, but it is on budget, and actually the vast majority of what we've done the first 5 years has been on time. We reckon we have more capacity in the supply chain should we need it. But all of these schemes, particularly the ones that are going to be delivered in the next 5 years, they're all contracted. The designers are on site. The contracting companies know who they are. They know which jobs they've won. So, yeah, we're pretty confident this can get done.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just interested in this smart motorway safety review. Could you say more, Jim, about what that has concluded? It's obviously been a big priority for Highways England, and there's been a huge amount of work around Greater Manchester, M60 and currently the M62. If I were to speak anecdotally in terms of what people say, they don't think the benefits that it brings outweighs the risks, and I just wonder whether you could reassure this board that there is a better argument to make for them. At the moment, people are hearing about the safety concerns. I hear what you say about confusion on lanes, but it doesn't appear to be just that. It seems to be a concern about vehicles stopping in a lane, not so much that the lane double runs at is used for different purposes at different times of the day, more that somebody might end up stopped on a lane without the ability to pull off into a lay-by. And I just wonder whether the safety review addresses that concern, as well as sort of making the case again for why smart motorway improves things. On the M60, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that people haven't felt it or they don't feel that they can see it.
No, I mean, thanks. The department and ourselves have spent the last 3 months examining the safety of smart motorways, and the Secretary of State personally has been all over the numbers. As he said today, overall they're safe. There are certain aspects of them which are more safe and certain aspects of them which are less safe. In the round, our motorways and smart motorways, there's this much between them in the different measures, and they are the safest roads in the country and in the world, both of them. So we start from there. We recognise that there has been a public concern, in particular about live lane breakdowns, and what do we do to address that concern?
So looking across all of the solutions that are available to us, the ones that we have picked in particular are firstly the stopped vehicle detection, which means that the control rooms will be alerted to a breakdown within 20 seconds. And we would expect to analyse where that breakdown is and have set the signs and signals within 3 minutes from the first notification. We're going to increase the traffic officer patrolling so that we can get the response time to having someone on site to less than 10 minutes. So we think those will provide a shift in safety performance and will provide a great deal of reassurance. We looked at putting in extra emergency areas. Actually, they don't make, surprising as it may seem, they don't make a difference to the safety performance of the road. We have roads where there are large gaps between them and they have lower accident rates than some of the places where they are closer together. It's the evidence confounds common sense, but we have an awful lot of evidence now that looks at that spacing, and the spacing makes very little difference, if any, to the safety of the roads. That is really surprising. We have committed to fitting another 10 refuge areas on the M25 to test that out. We've started building them. They will be open later this year, and we would expect them to prove that putting the extra ERAs in makes no difference, because that's the experience now. We have 600,000 journeys a day. We have over 300 miles of these roads, and we can find absolutely no correlation between that spacing and the breakdown rates. So you have to look for other ways to genuinely improve the safety. The stop vehicle detection is one, removing some of the confusion, educating drivers on how to be safer on roads, what to do in the event of a breakdown. We're going to massively improve the communications. We're going to revisit the highway code right across all of our high-speed roads, because what we're realising is that actually this is the same problem on dual carriageways. This happens a lot on conventional motorways too. It is not, where you have a 3 or 4 lane motorway moving at high speed. It is not always possible to make it to an ERA, but it's not always possible to make it to the hard shoulder either. So we're pretty confident that we have a comprehensive package of measures which will address the safety challenges that people have raised.
Very, very quickly. And is there evidence that they bring benefits?
Oh, sorry, yes. They certainly do. The best example where we have the most and the longest experience now is in the Midlands, and typically journey times are being, on the M6 in particular, journey times have been reduced by up to 40 minutes. We know that, and sometimes the benefits actually are not just on the smart motorway, because we expect a certain journey time benefit when we plan them, and we don't get that journey time benefit because what we find is that more people use the smart motorway, and actually a lot of the journey time benefits turn out to be on the local roads, because now that the journey, where a road is congested, people will rat run until the journey time is the same for everybody. And what we're finding is that people are more willing to use the extra capacity on the motorway, and therefore you get some journey time improvement on the smart motorway, but not what you were expecting. But you get a similar journey time improvement where people have been using the local roads to do those journeys and come out on the smart motorways. And incidentally, those people who are using local roads for those journeys and come out and do that journey on the smart motorway are up to 5 times safer than they were on the local roads. So it's actually, despite the publicity, it is actually quite impressive.
Sorry if you've made reference to this. Picking up on Andy's point, I thought the problem was that there was a time lag between putting up the red cross on the signage to take people out of the lane. That was the problem. I don't know if I know there's been a lot more. Just anecdotally about it, so I drive down the M1 quite a bit. There seems to have been a lot more on the big signs about telling people that if there's a cross there, don't use it. So it seems as though they have responded to that criticism, but I don't know if that technology has actually been addressed to give people good warning.
That's correct. I mean, the first thing is that the police forces have been using these speed cameras to enforce that red X now. So if you drive under a red X and there's a speed camera mounted on the gantry, you will get fined. We wanted we've been doing that for 2 or 3 months. The Secretary of State felt it was best to hold that announcement and make it part of the package because it would draw more attention. We're not interested in the fines, we're interested in the compliance. So to have people know that if they drive under one of those red X's, they will get a ticket for it is actually what we want, because it means that they obey the red X. So that's an improvement in safety. The fitment of the stopped vehicle detection, the radar system, means that we will get an indication that there is a single vehicle broken down on the road much more quickly, and that red X will be set more quickly. So yes, and so bringing it to the public attention, that using those message screens to put that up is the first step in what is much more of a much broader communications campaign. We're going to use primetime TV for the first time ever to get this message out there. It's the first time ever that we will have used that for road safety public information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I welcome those reassurances on behalf of North Yorkshire residents. Although we don't have a smart motorway in North Yorkshire, many of our residents do use those in West Yorkshire, and there have been concerns expressed. So I welcome those reassurances. I also welcome the announcement regarding future dualling of the A64 between Hopgrove Roundabout and Barton Hill. And I wonder, finally, Mr. Chairman, whether Jim could give us some clarity. We have had a bid in with the Department for Transport for about a year now to improve the connectivity east to west between Lancashire and Yorkshire on the A59 at Kecksgill. I wonder whether you can tell us whether or not that bid has yet been considered positively.
To my embarrassment, I'm not sure that the A59 is one of Highways England's roads, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to get back to you with a written answer. No, okay, so I know it's my DFT colleague has left the room temporarily, but so I can't comment. I only do I'm only the chief exec of Highways England, not the entire English road network. So
the DFT is here, and
sorry,
you've offered to take the point back and get clarity for Councillor Mackenzie. Yeah, thank you very much.
I feel as I should declare an interest, because when it's closed, all of that traffic from Skipton to Harrogate comes down my road in Otley. But it is a really serious problem, and I understand it's the decision is almost there that they're going to have to rebuild that stretch of the road, because it's just in such a terrible predicament.
Well, I apologise yet again to the residents of Otley and Ilkley for the diversions that do occur. And that is exactly why, Mr. Chairman, that we've made this bid, and we are very hopeful that we'll be able to get the scheme underway.
We'll hear back from DFT, and thank you, Jim, for that full briefing and a very fascinating Q&A. This is what happens, colleagues, when we're so good with our time management. We can seize the moment on an issue of the day and just drill down. And I'm picking up what Andy said. It is fascinating how the public perception, and I'm not trivialising public perception in any way whatever, public concern about smart motorways, it's really interesting to hear what the evidence base actually tells us and to see how we're going to take forward this very, very important review, which clearly not only needs to be the right thing to do from a scientific point of view, but also take the public with us. So, Jim, thank you for what you're doing in this important regard. On that basis, we'll have an 8-minute comfort break and a cup of coffee break, a chance to chat. If people could be back promptly, please, for 2:30. The reason I say promptly is we have a very important item on decarbonisation, and I want to make sure we can give it justice. 2:30, restart. Thank you. Morning. Eva and I go back quite a long way, but it's great to have you with us here from the Climate Change Committee to talk to us in just a few minutes' time about the massively important issue of decarbonisation and our own role in that. But just before we get to that item, we have an update on the Northern Transport Charter, and I'm going to give the floor to Judith.
Yes, I'll try and be brief, Chair. We've got some substantial papers in front of us outlining the work that we've been doing, and you'll remember the 4 ambitions, which are clearly marked on the paper. I'm very pleased to say to be able to see in other documents that the work that we did through Blake Jones that's fed into this, particularly putting the North Rail passengers first, is actually been taken up across the country and through different elements involved in the transport agenda. So, and just to emphasise that you know we're going to work that right across the piece. It's not just about rail passengers; it's about all forms of transport. So we got slightly interrupted with the election, as you know, but I think we've had some really useful discussions. I'm going to hand over to David to give us the details of where we are. And I think we've had quite a lot of good publicity in the build-up to the budget with the Northern Budget work that we've been doing and the promotion that we've got through that. Obviously, still some work to go through in terms of the overall package around governance, and we'll look forward to reporting back at subsequent meetings. But if I could hand over to David for the detail, that would be really helpful.
Thank you, Judith. So, as Judith says, the four ambitions of the Transport Charter that was approved by the board back in September last year are set out on the first page of the paper. This report focuses its progress update on two of those four ambitions, namely the long-term funding settlement, by which we mean a Northern devolved budget, and alongside that, the ambition of leading strategic transport delivery, by which we mean the decision-making and governance frameworks that we would need to put in place in order to be able to manage a devolved budget. So the report focuses on those two ambitions. The intent is to bring an update on the remaining two ambitions to the next meeting of the board, whenever that might be, in person or virtually, recognising that in respect of the ambition around putting the North's rail passengers first, the yet to be published Williams review is going to be a significant input into that. So that's where we are. This is on two of the four ambitions, and there is, as Judith says, quite detailed papers on both, on the Northern devolved budget, which is the paper that's attached at Appendix 2, and on the proposed decision-making and governance model, the detail of which is included in Appendix 3. Insofar as possible, the work that we've been doing, which has been led by the members' working group chaired by Judith, has been looking to build on previous positions agreed by the board. In particular, in respect of the devolved budget, the work has been aligned to the board's previously agreed position on the funding framework and in the strategic transport plan. What we set out in the appendix is the steps that we think we would need to take, the phased approach that we would need to go through in order to meet the full ambition of a devolved multimodal investment budget for the North based on a government funding settlement. The detail on the decision-making and accountability that's set out in Appendix 3 tries to work through some of the key stages that one would expect to see in any investment decision-making cycle, and has looked to preserve to this board some of the key decisions around prioritisation, but then looked at how some of the management thereafter can be delegated to appropriate levels, and we might want to pick some of that up in our discussion. Section 4 of the covering paper sets out our proposed next steps. Again, the intent, subject to travel restrictions, etc., is that we have a further members' working group at the end of this month to endorse, in effect, final positions on these two ambitions, on the devolved budget and on the governance and decision-making framework, reflecting any outputs from the discussion today. And then we would bring those back for final sign-off at the next board. The intent is that a finalised Northern Transport Charter, particularly in respect of these two ambitions, would form a significant input into TFN's spending review submission later in the year. So the recommendation to the board is to note the progress that's set out in these reports.
Any questions for Judith and David on the work that we previously asked for and which is proceeding well by all accounts? Judith?
We have had we have got an extended membership now, but I would just encourage anyone. We want to make sure every area is represented, and I think the most important thing is all of the sub regions, if that's the right way of describing it, of the board area really do engage in this and make sure, because if we're moving forward to deliver all of the issues around transparency and governance and decision making, we need to make sure that we get the fullest engagement from right across the piece.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Yes, please, Michael.
Thanks, Chairman. I welcome the progress on this today. It's clearly moving forward. But just one point to raise is to have consideration to the resource implication moving forward for both members and the officers that support us in our constituent authorities, because not all authorities may well have the capacity in terms of the skill sets that might be required to support members. That's something that we just need to be aware of and to address at some point. Thank you.
And subject to being able to physically meet, we look forward to further papers. If not, we'll make the agreements through conference calls. Thank you. We move on to decarbonisation then, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome Eva from the Committee for Climate Change. And would you like to make an opening presentation?
Thanks very much for having me here. So I've been told I've got about 10 minutes and I've got quite a few slides to get through, so I'm going to try and talk quite quickly. I'm going to tell you a bit about what the committee do and go through our most recent advice, the key recommendations from our net zero report, which was published last year. So for those of you who aren't aware of the Committee on Climate Change, we were established under the 2008 Climate Change Act. And our role is to advise the UK government and the devolved administrations on emissions targets. And what we do is report to Parliament rather than government on progress meeting them, including on adaptation as well as mitigation. So I'm just going to take you through a summary of the key recommendations and really focus on the surface transport sector. So I suppose the most obvious thing to say is that the main recommendation was that the UK should legislate as soon as possible a target for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and that should include all sectors, including international aviation and shipping, and all greenhouse gases, not just CO2. We think that this should be met largely through, well, all through UK domestic effort without relying on international credits or trading. And now is the right time to set this target. We think it's technically feasible with existing technologies and behaviours, and it's the right thing to do in terms of making an appropriate contribution to the Paris Agreement. There's a lot of scientific evidence in the report if anyone's interested, and this takes you through the arguments around global pathways of greenhouse gas emissions that are consistent with Paris and what that translates into the UK. But a net zero target, we think, meets that. There's no point in setting a new target without any action to deliver it. So a lot of emphasis of the report is on delivery, and it really emphasises that the need to scale up significantly on the policy side across all sectors of the economy, particularly in the next decade. And that will require strong leadership at the heart of government. It's a big step up from the previous 80% target. It means we need to go faster and decarbonise more than we previously did under the old target. What this means is that we need to engage with business and consumers to bring them along and to create a stable and long-term framework in which investments can be made. We did a lot of updating of the costs across the economy of achieving net zero, and we found that the costs were manageable. In fact, the range of costs that we have for net zero, the 1 to 2% of GDP per year, was the same as the previous cost for the 80% reduction, which is quite startling, but is due to the reduction in a lot of the renewable technology costs, but also battery costs. And there are also a lot of co-benefits, which I probably haven't really got time to go through. So this is one of the summary charts which shows what the actions are needed across the different sectors, and probably just want to pick up one or two things here. The delivery of carbon capture and storage is really critical, and we were pleased to see 800 million pledged in the budget yesterday for 2 operation carbon capture and storage clusters by 2030. It's not as far as we were recommending, but it's a start. There's the bringing forward of electric vehicle switchover date to 2035, which was announced previous to the budget. We need to scale up the decarbonisation of electricity supply and fully decarbonise heating and industry emissions. There's also a big role, and this is coming more to the fore now, in terms of nature-based solutions and tree planting and peatland restoration in particular. I suppose looking at aviation, what we say is that there needs to be a strategy to manage aviation emissions and demand growth in the UK, not just rely on the international framework for this. And because all the sectors can't reach gross zero emissions, we need to develop funding options for UK CO2 removals. So that's the sort of whistle-stop tour of the economy-wide messages. I'll now turn to surface transport, which is more your area. This is just by way of background, looking at what's happening to transport emissions. I mean, basically, they're the largest emitting sector of the UK economy now, representing 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. And if you look on the chart on the right, that shows how sectors have performed since 1990. And basically, economy-wide emissions fell by over 40% over this period, but transport emissions have remained broadly flat. And in the more recent periods, in the most recent 5-year periods, the situation's even worse for surface transport. It's increased by 4%. So we have a big and growing problem in the transport sector. I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of split of emissions in surface transport, but it's dominated by cars, which is 60%, HGVs and vans, which are about 17-18% each. And they account for over 95% of all transport emissions. So the focus from our side of things is really on those 3 sectors. But we do think we have the technologies and behaviours to get us close to zero emissions by 2050 in surface transport, despite the recent increases. And this chart shows the residual emissions in 2050. These are these 2 right-hand stacked bar charts. The third one across was consistent with the 80% reduction target, and really this demonstrates that the level of effort needed for net zero compared to that is much more drastic. Before we didn't really have to bother about the really hard to decarbonise bits of transport like long distance HGVs, but now they're really very much in the frame. So how do we get there? So the key elements for reducing transport emissions are cars, vans and motorcycles to increasingly electrify. So one of the key things that I've mentioned earlier was stopping the sale of non-zero emission vehicles, including plug-in hybrids, by 2035 at the latest. A transition of HGVs to zero emissions options during the 2030s. A more ambitious programme of rail electrification, including hydrogen trains, but also be aware of the travel demand equation. So it's not just about technologies, it's about trying to reduce demand or switch it to less carbon intensive modes, both on the passenger side and on the freight side. This chart shows our latest analysis of electric vehicle costs for cars versus conventional vehicle costs, given that it's such a key element of our decarbonisation strategy. And the basic message here is that whatever basis you choose to look at costs, social or private costs, whether you include taxes or not, or subsidies, EVs are cheaper on a total cost of ownership basis than conventional vehicles by 2030. And the key driver for this is that battery costs are falling much rapidly than anyone expected over the past 2 or 3 years. And what this means is that, I mean, this was really important in the committee's advice on bringing forward the government's original 2040 phase-out date, because what it shows is that you can actually save money from an economy-wide perspective through an earlier switchover date. We did consider recommending a 2030 switchover date, but we thought there was a balancing act to do in terms of thinking about the supply side constraints and how difficult it might be for some of the manufacturers to change all their manufacturing processes and increase the supply, just change the whole supply chains. So the 2035 at the latest was a bit of a compromise in terms of that discussion. Another challenge is in terms of this whole EV switching over to EVs is a significant scaling up of EV infrastructure that's required, both in terms of home charging and public fast and rapid chargers for those without off-street parking and topping up as people make their journeys. So I mentioned the need to address travel demand, and I think the evidence on this is a bit less well developed than other areas, but our net zero ambition, we have a scenario that reduces passenger kilometres by 10%, so you can see it there, by 2050. That might not seem a lot, but taking into account that a lot of the trips are relatively short, it's a much higher proportion of trips. About 37% of the shortest trips we think can be switched. So just moving rapidly on for HGVs, we've basically, these are sort of, the technologies are less developed and there's no clear winner at the moment, and companies are testing various zero emission options, and the 3 main ones are hydrogen, electricity with on-road refuelling through catenary systems or conductive charging on the roads, and electricity with megacharges, which Tesla are currently modelling. There are issues and challenges amongst all of these. So hydrogen production's more energy intensive than electricity. Overhead catenaries are very infrastructure intensive and probably can cause a lot of disruption. And battery development for HGVs is still uncertain, and it would still require we think around 600 megacharges across the country, as well as depot charging for that to be a viable solution. So our recommendation to government in this area was that the government should assist with large-scale trials now, like starting in the 2020s, and to establish which of these technologies is likely to be the most cost-effective and feasible technology before rollout can start in earnest in the beginning of the 2030s. This is one of the key charts that we have for all of the sectors, and it just sets out the policies and the timing needed to achieve our net zero targets. And we'll be updating this advice in our 6th carbon budget report, which is coming next year. But I think I've been through most of these issues, so I won't go through that. And the last slide really is around government response and next steps. So we were really pleased with the response to the Net Zero report, and the government legislated the target in June last year. So that was a great achievement for us. Treasury are going to be doing a report on the just transition, so ensuring that, you know, all sectors are treated equally, and ensuring that the transition protects the most vulnerable people. DFT are due to issue a consultation on a decarbonisation plan. We think it's imminent, but it always seems to be imminent, so I'm not so sure. But the actual plan will be published, we think, before the Conference of Parties in November. There's a Cabinet Committee now to coordinate action on climate change. And as I mentioned, we're going to be publishing our 6th carbon budget advice, which sets out a trajectory covering the mid-2030s and highlights the priorities and actions for government in the following decade. So that report's coming in the autumn. And then we have the COP26 in November 2020 in Glasgow. So there's a lot going on in this space.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Very comprehensive. We'll come back, Eva, to a discussion just in a moment, but just before we open it up, David, do you want to complement what Eva said by our own work within TFN and what you're looking for from the board?
Yes, thanks, Chair, and thanks, Eva. So we've included a short paper under item 14 in the pack. The paper really just recaps previous commitments in our strategic transport plan and in the Northern Transport Charter, and summarises some of the work that TFN has been undertaking in collaboration with members over the previous year, and sets out some of the work planned for the year ahead. I think what we're looking for, both in the discussion and offline with members and with members' officers, is for input to help shape our forward work plan in this area. Clearly, it's a hugely important agenda, but it's also a very wide agenda, and TFN as an organisation has quite limited resource, so we need to ensure that we focus our efforts in this space to best effect. And I think that probably included in that means focusing in on how we cater for these policy objectives in our investment programme, evaluation and appraisal frameworks. We're mindful that, as set out in para 3.3 of the summary paper, that as things stand, many of the significant policy levers are held at a national government level rather than at regional level. Eva noted there on that last slide that some of the reports that are expected over the course of the coming year, in particular the DfT commitment to publishing a transport decarbonisation plan before the conference in Glasgow, and we see providing input into the development of that plan as perhaps the key short-term focus for TFN. But again, we'd welcome members' views on that. And the paper is presented to members for noting. Thanks,
Thank
Chair.
you very much. Let's open it up now for discussion. Kishore.
Yeah, thank you for the report. And from the Humber perspective, this decarbonisation is part of the key element of a local industrial strategy, whole-scale decarbonisation, including transport and industry as well. So again, at a regional level, we'd quite like to be involved in any development of transport-related activities out of that. That would help us as well. Thank you.
Yes, just following on from Keisha, I think you're saying absolutely right that the strategic goals we've got have to sort of match with the investment policy, and it's about, because after all, it's about what interventions we can make or assist in making that make a real difference, can't we? And you know what I'm going to say, this I'll say every time, it's about early wins, and it's about what Keisha said today, and colleagues from elsewhere in the Humber have said. It's about not ruling out freight and ensuring that freight on rail is key to anything we do around NPR, because if we, we can't do anything about HGVs, but we can make sure that a lot of that freight isn't in an HGV, which we can't if we don't ensure those pinch points are removed as part of the previous discussions we've had. But it's also about electrification, because what you've said is we need to decarbonise electricity supply, and we can do that. Well, one thing's for certain, if there is no, if there's still diesel trains from Hull to Selby, there's still diesel trains. So there's quick wins that we can suggest. The other thing that I would suggest, if we're serious about modal shift, is it's about what role we play, and we're well placed around transport infrastructure. I work for another authority where they've got a large fleet of electrical vehicles, but people still fight for the diesel vehicle when they're driving out of town, not because that borough hasn't got a good sourcing of recharging points. It's because the places you're going to haven't. So it's about ensuring that that's only going to, if we're serious about that electric modal shift coming early, it's got to be incentivised by government, or there's got to be some sort of comprehensive method, which means that actually, it's more important if I'm driving to Sheffield, what Sheffield's got in the way of charging points than what I've got in Hull or what we've got in North East Lincolnshire or wherever. So I think that part of it is key to that shift, because not everybody wants to just drive in the town they're in, do they? They want to, if we're talking about serious modal shift and down the M62, it's got to be about where is the charging infrastructure.
Thank you. Yes.
It's a point very much connected with that. It may be my very poor eyesight, but I worked out that 94% of emissions come from road traffic, HGV or domestic and vans. So I just wonder whether we are using that evidence enough in terms of the messaging to government around all of our programmes, and saying, taking Andy's point earlier around future-proofing, not just for immediacy, but in 10, 20, 30 years' time, so that it actually links in with the decarbonisation programme, so that we are very much using this evidence to put our case forward for extra capacity in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Just relating to what Darren was saying, I totally agree with him there, and I think it's my authority that he's relating to, where we've got 25 electric vehicles for the authority, and we are exploring now the issues of waste recycling vehicles as well. So we are looking at that in a big way. And I do believe that most authorities, I'm sure, like North East Lincolnshire, will have an emergency climate policy in place. And I think it's something that we've got to take a big concern about, and it is a concern at the moment about the climate. And I'm pleased that TFN is actually, looking at this in a big way. And I appreciate the presentation that's been given us today, but we're all got to be aware that it's our responsibility to protect the planet and do as much as we can. And I'm glad that TFN are working towards that as well. I would ask, Chair, if it's possible, I don't know if anybody else who wants this or not, but I would like that presentation, if it can be forwarded to either members or to our authorities. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, Chair, coming from the same area as my colleagues who've just spoken, I'll take perhaps a different look at the issue of HGVs in particular. I quite agree that moving heavy transport from road to rail has to be a good thing. But when I look at so many areas of the UK, they don't have developed rail networks and probably never will. So you're still going to have the issue of moving large quantities of goods by road. Really interested in the presentation, because one question was answered there that I've never had answered before, and that was the primary disadvantage with hydrogen, in the fact that it at the moment is more costly to produce than electricity. And I wonder if that is perhaps the next great challenge, is bringing down the cost of hydrogen production. Because for me, it would seem to be a very clear choice
for powering larger road vehicles and possibly trains, and even possibly aircraft, be it through fuel cells or be it through direct combustion. So I think that is a major challenge, is research into hydrogen production.
Thank you, Chair. I should declare an interest because I'm the chairman of the electric vehicle electrification business. I just wanted to ask and point out that we talk about decarbonisation, and a lot of it tends to be in the negative in terms of there's a cost involved in this. I just wanted to identify that I think we have a great opportunity by working between Transport for the North and the 11 LEPs, either through NP11 or directly, because the platform that we have through our transport networks as a test bed for the great capabilities and the engineering capabilities we have in our region to kind of lead on the decarbonisation agenda is massive. I will remind people that the Europe's largest volume battery electric vehicle is actually made in our region. The 2 battery plants that the UK has in our region, and we have a lot of capability right across our manufacturing sector and our manufacturing space. But in order to drive that agenda forward, we actually should demonstrate the capabilities, and we should use our transport networks as a demonstration capability for our businesses. So I would just urge that when we're looking at this as a strategy, we look at the economic case for our business community as much as just looking at it from a pure decarbonisation perspective.
It's a point well made, and links back to the core mission of Transport for the North and our starting point of looking at economic transformation in the north of England for communities with transport as a means to achieve that economic transformation. It's another version of it. Andy.
Thank you, Chair. It was an excellent presentation, as others have said, but I think I want to build on what Mark was saying a moment ago. I don't think this board, or indeed the department, is fully yet bringing together these 2 agendas around transport improvement and meeting the climate challenge. I think we've got them in different bits of the policy sort of world at the moment. So take yesterday's budget, no mention in the speech of clean air, and yet Judith, I think, just looking on the table, certainly ourselves, we're under a legal requirement to have a clean air zone within a year, and at the moment there isn't that funding committed to us to get that test bed going of the kind of that's helping people switch their vehicles. So I kind of feel at the moment this isn't joined up properly at all. Transport improvement needs to become the same as decarbonisation. The 2 need to be one and the same thing, and they're not at the moment, not at this board and not within government, because the JACU function is away from the DFT and they don't fully line up. So to make it very real, we are soon to take a decision on buses in Greater Manchester and reform of. It obviously makes sense to look at that alongside the bringing in of new vehicles that meet the clean air standards, but possibly more than that, the electric vehicles, and we've got some of those coming through at the moment. But it isn't aligned, and it's the last item on the agenda today. No criticism of you, Chair, but I just think it's almost like it's a sort of not our first thought, it's an afterthought. And I think whenever we're discussing anything, really, it should now be a case of how does transport improvement further decarbonisation? They've got to be the same thing, and it's almost in every paper we look at. We've been at this board where we've discussed renewing diesel trains. It just shouldn't be really. And I think if I was hearing Mark, what he was saying, the future-proofing side of things with regard to a zero-carbon future needs to be every single discussion on any transport improvement. That needs to be in our thinking. And I'm just telling you this because I feel very much that we could be about to reform buses and then have to ask the bus industry to reform them all again in a few years once the funding comes through on clean air, and that would make no sense whatsoever.
Thank you for the presentation. I find it a bit difficult because in Leeds we've got a target of 2030, and I find talking about 2050 is really difficult because where will we be by 2050 if we haven't made significant progress? So I'm slightly concerned about TFN not not matching the ambition of its constituent parts, because I think most areas are actually set targets way much earlier than that, and I think we need to reflect our ambition around that. Just going through the charter, Blake Jones. What have we been talking about is putting people at the centre of everything we do. I've looked through the paper. There's no mention about passengers, road users, train users, and I think that's where we're missing a point, because my concern is that we just try and replicate the way that people move around now, and we'll still end up with the congestion on the roads if we just replace petrol and diesel cars with electric cars. And I just think we're missing a trick. I actually really also want to pick up the link to the economic transformation. I think the way the government is going, that Transport for the North has to up its game on the economic side. I think it's absolutely imperative. Otherwise, we're just going to be missing. We're just not going to be hitting the spot with government at the moment. And so that then links to inclusive growth, and again to the needs of the travelling public. But I hope that Transport for the North can actually help local authorities who are more and more now turning down planning applications because they're not meeting the climate obligations in terms of housing developments that are completely isolated from public transport networks. That we're in Leeds, we're starting to turn down significant planning applications because they haven't got that connectivity in, and I think that we need to join up with that through Transport for the North. Actually, our clean air zone is going live. We've just heard in September. It should have gone live last year, but the department couldn't get the technology to work at the right time. So we're actually going live in September. So that will be interesting. We're not including the private vehicle at the moment, but already in Leeds, you can feel the difference because our taxes are converting as a result of the change, and you can just feel the noise levels have obviously one thing, and the way the city centre works is the taxes are really a large part of the vehicles on the street now, and it really is starting to make a difference, as well as the buses starting to change as well, and it really is starting to hit. But I'm just concerned that we're not ambitious, and I think we've got to really rack up our ambition here to really, if we're going into COP26 in November and we haven't got more progress than where we are now, I think we're really going to be in trouble. With hydrogen, I think we should link the transport element to all of the work that's happening around the domestic appliances, because if in terms of replacement, if you're talking about replacing all of the gas appliances, then the costs are just absolutely through the roof, and I think that's where we can really make the case for hydrogen. I think the problem with hydrogen is more about the trust issue. There's a real nervousness in because of past high-profile incidents with hydrogen, that there's a real concern as to how stable it actually is, and I think we need to do a lot of work. But from a local authority perspective, the thing that we are getting absolutely hammered by is aviation, and nowhere is picking up responsibility for policy on aviation. I'd like your response to that, because we're the planning authority that Leeds Bradford Airport sits within. The airport wants to expand. We have protesters coming to all of our meetings. I'm sure that Manchester will be the same. Obviously, North Somerset has blocked the expansion of Bristol Airport. I think the local authority next to Stansted has blocked the expansion at Stansted. But there doesn't seem to be anywhere who is actually picking up responsibility for the emissions from aviation, and that is that is a real problem for all of us. And if we don't get a national policy around aviation, then we can do all of this, but we will just get continue to be really hammered by, the right across the piece, anyone who is concerned about climate emergency.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. And I think it's a linked point to what others were making, both in terms of timings and this is an emergency, and also on quick wins. And when I look at the proposed work programme in the documents, there's a lot of strategy, which is great because it's a complicated issue. I guess I'd just really endorse us all to try to set up some pilots really quickly that can inform that strategy as well as the thinking. And I think, to Andrew's earlier point, that the LEPs and NP11 could play a role of involving businesses in some of those pilots. And I wonder whether the role of TFN could be to have coordination so that we can really coordinate that approach and have it inform government strategy later.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult for the CCC to be saying much about what individual local authorities are doing because we work very much on a national picture, and I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the national level actions that we set out in our advice and what's happening on the ground. And I think there is work to be done to try and bridge that gap a little bit and think about what that means for the different regions of the UK and the different local authorities, but I don't think we have a clear answer, and I think you have to devolve some of those powers. Well, I mean, those powers are devolved anyway, so you have to give those local authorities powers to make their own decisions because they know best about those local conditions and the populations that they cover. So might seem a bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I don't think I've...
It's a very important subject.
Yeah.
Back to Andy's point about joined up agendas.
Yeah.
The second thing I'd just like to ask you on the joined up agendas point is different forms of environmental impact. So Andy made the point about our responsibilities for air pollution. And certainly, one of the things I've done in the last few years was the review of longer working and the retirement age for government. And that really educated me on the issue of premature deaths as a result, particularly of urban air pollution, which receives nothing near the attention that climate change receives. And we well understand why climate change is in many ways the arrowhead. But if we're looking at environmental impacts of our investments as a transport authority, there are wider pollution issues. And sometimes government, allow me to say, I think gets itself slightly into difficulty. Diesel would be a classic example of pursuing one environmental objective and then realising it has other environmental implications. Clearly your responsibilities at the committee relate to climate change. But any thoughts on how we get a joined up agenda so that we tackle all of the significant environmental impacts which are damaging the lives and prospects of northern citizens without doing one thing and causing another problem?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we do try and set out in our analysis what the co-benefits and the risks are in pursuing our targets, and I think this is a really important thing in the land sector as well as transport. So, yeah, there's no single answer to this, but I think what we need to try and really demonstrate clearly is particularly the risks, but also the co-benefits, because you can bring people along if you can demonstrate that you can get cleaner air and better health for populations living in very polluted and very congested areas at the moment. So I think you can, if you do try and highlight the benefits of decarbonisation on things like air quality and health and recreation by making your environment better to live in, then you'll bring a lot of people along the path and along the journey together with you.
And then another point I think came up as a thread throughout comments. Could I ask you to say just a little bit more? I know we very much constrained the time you had at the opening presentation. Thank you for doing it. About mode shift, because I think you made some very compelling points with your evidence on the technological solutions to replacing a fossil fuel vehicle with an electric vehicle with huge benefits, which clearly all of us are very committed to. But I think we talk a lot about trying to get more people to use public transport as an alternative to personal transport, rail as against a road. We talk about rail freight strategies. But again, it's got to be evidence-based. There are hundreds of thousands of articulated vehicles. If we create another rail freight path, which is a very laudable thing to do, we influence perhaps thousands of vehicles rather than hundreds of thousands of vehicles. But I'm thinking of, you know, the classic school run issue. If we could get more people to take their children to work walking or using a yellow bus in the American sense, we'd make a huge impact on road transport. So within your plans, what would you be thinking we ought to be, what's our level of ambition on mode shift?
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas where it's really difficult to say what the potential is and to try and develop policies to achieve that. There's been a lot of work by Leeds University on, and actually Manchester has done a lot of this on setting a vision for the type of transport and the type of city they want to see, and then just delivering that through policies and measures. So rather than a sort of predict and provide approach to road building and meeting travel demand, you set a vision to what you want to achieve. And I think that's really compelling to me. But I think, you know, that there's also a role in technologies, you know, technology solutions, and also ride sharing and the move to automated vehicles can present risks and opportunities to this area. But I think, as Adair Turner, our previous chairman, once said, if companies were, if people were companies, they would never invest in a car because it sits outside your house depreciating 90% of the time. And it's not really a rational decision. But I think that really sort of highlights to me how the emotion that people attach to owning a car, and it's really that we need to try and break, which is not easy.
And finally, could you help us with Judith's point on aviation? Because when we produced our strategic transport plan, and we had a very good dialogue with our colleagues in the environmental stakeholder community, the aviation bit was a bit challenging, not because we didn't recognise how important it was, but we have a certain amount of leverage over road investment and rail investment. We have an interest in the economic importance of aviation as part of our Northern Powerhouse economic strategy, as we do with port capacity, but we don't have the same direct leverage. We have indirect leverage, and I'm not in any point diminishing that, but clearly those are private sector assets. We have a planning responsibility, but the investment is a private sector investment. So we directly, and it's not an excuse, but we directly cannot simply do as much by a board decision on whether we do or don't go ahead with a road scheme or a rail scheme. So within your climate change committee work, getting purchase on aviation emissions, given demand growth, and again, public wishes to be able to fly, any thoughts on that are relevant to us here in the north?
Also, the aviation sector is one of the sectors that we expect will have residual emissions by 2050 because you simply can't decarbonise it fully. So we expect aviation to offset some of those emissions through things like planting trees and peatland restoration. And international aviation and shipping at the moment aren't covered by carbon budgets because the government see this as being an international issue and an international solution. But the committee beg to differ on that. We think there are a lot of UK things that the airline industry can do in the UK. So increasingly efficient planes and operational measures that they can take to reduce aviation emissions. And also, I think there has to be some appreciation that we cannot continually increase demand indefinitely in aviation, and although we need it for growth, we can cap that at a reasonable level, particularly because aviation demand is very focused on about 30% of the population take more than 70% of the flights. So it's a very much a middle to upper class issue and business class issue, and it's not other people are you know, suffering, I suppose, because of the actions of a minority of the population.
Was there anything else, having heard the conversation, that you'd like to respond to?
I suppose I agree that transport decarbonisation needs to be really joined up, and it's not at the moment, not at the national level and not at the local level. And I think this is one thing that we struggle with. For example, DfT give out car grants for electric vehicles on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they don't raise fuel duty when they have an opportunity to do so, and they allow the continued rise of really big SUVs and really big cars on the roads through their VED and taxation policies. So at the national level, it's not joined up, and you know, I think that's a real challenge to make sure that at least at the local level it tries to be.
The board members, do you have anything you want to come back on in terms of TfN's further work on this area?
Well, I think it's very helpful for us to hear those comments from members. I think there's a lot there for us to reflect on as we try and develop the work plan for the year ahead. I mean, I think the points made about reconciling targets and ambitions across the member authorities is something that we'll need to grapple with, and we need to balance that with an appreciation of what levers we might have and that we could develop in consultation with members and with government. I think this concept of kind of mainstreaming the decarbonisation and climate change agenda into what we do is rather than it being an add-on, it is really critical. And I think that, you know, where TfN really needs to make that real is in the way that we, as I said in my opening comments, in trying to absolutely embed that in terms of the way that we appraise and evaluate our investment programme, absolutely consistent with the ambition in the Transport Charter around inclusive and sustainable growth. So, and also on top of that, I think looking very carefully, you know, given that the resource we have, you know, I think the point about looking at what role we can play in coordinating pilot projects and other initiatives across members is something that we need to take away and look at. But it was a very helpful discussion and grateful for members' contributions.
Chair, can I just make a point? Just don't want to leave it sort of slightly unchallenged. I mean, the idea that the former chair of the committee says that it's not a rational decision to buy, it's irrational to buy a car. That's a very London-centric view, because most of the communities around this table, most of our residents have no choice but to own a car because of A, the cost of public transport, and B, the patchy nature of it. And I think we've all got to get louder on this point. We obsess on infrastructure, and we've done it pretty much understandably, but we are not talking enough as Transport for the North about the everyday cost of public transport in the north of England. The fact that if you get on a bus and then you get on a train, you're a new customer every time. You keep paying every time you change. In London, you don't do that. You have a cap. And I just think that is actually much more relevant to a lot of our residents. And I think we over-focus on the infrastructure. If you're to get the behaviour change that you're kind of rightly kind of pushing for, you have to bring down the cost of public transport in a more integrated system and to make it attractive, more attractive than the car. At the moment, I'm afraid the car wins. It's cheaper for 3 or 4 kids to get an Uber in Greater Manchester than it is for them to catch a bus. And until you change the economics of that, we're not going to begin to, it's not just an emotional attachment, I'm afraid. It's just a everyday financial and work reality that people have to use their cars in the north of England.
Can I just add as well the other omission that we haven't...
Say again?
The omission from today is we haven't emphasised active travel and reducing the need to get in a vehicle of any type at all.
Yeah.
So that needs to be in everything we do.
Actually, I was struck, colleagues, by the consistency of comments around the table, whether it was from local authority representatives or LEP representatives, whether it was from people in principally rural areas or people in urban areas. There was a strong consistency of message. And if I just try and sum up, David, what I think those were, I think there was a message about raising our level of ambition. And none of these points, they're new for you because it's your first meeting, but they're not new for us around this board table. Board members have asked us to, and that's why Barry put this item on the agenda and invited Eva to come. But we are being asked to raise our level of ambition, and that's a really important point. We're being asked to mainstream what we do, and we have committed to do that. It isn't an easy thing to do, but that's not an excuse for not doing it. This sort of, we'll get to the environment when we've discussed infrastructure, is what we've got to get over. And we are working hard, whether it be simply mainstreaming the issue within our papers or making sure that if we said we're interested in active travel, that it's a standard item, not just an afterthought. It's not easy, but we will do it. There's also the point about being joined up, which is a slightly different point. It's your point about PAN emission, PAN pollution, and it's the point about we are relatively small compared to central government. That gives us one advantage, that we can look at these things holistically, whereas Whitehall, as we know, has these different government departments with different statutory responsibilities. I heard a lot about mode shift of various guises, and as long as I've been chairing this board, to take one example, we've been pushing for more rail freight paths because we see that as part of the solution to the challenge that Eva's given us. But I think we have to get deeper into this subject. We have to know how much difference we can really make so that it's part of a consistent joined up strategy, and it's not by any means the only part of mode shift. And active travel is an important part of mode shift. And I think, Judith, we still haven't found the answer to what our contribution should be on aviation. And my earlier comments, I think, were only designed to reflect the difficulty of us handling the issue. It's not completely within our grasp. But as you've said, we're hitting it all the time. And we owe it to the environmental groups who've raised this with us that we have more to say on this issue. So I think I'd like to end with the point that a number of you made about the early wins. Again, a hardy perennial for us to make. It's the balance in our activities between doing enough on the long-term important strategy, but balancing it with enough on the short-term today issues. But I think there's a broader point than the early wins, and it's the point about things that impact on the citizen, things that the northern citizen can see that we are doing which would make a difference to their daily lives by improving their daily lives and also improving the environment, which I think, Andy, is where you're coming from on identifying these things that actually could be changed, that could make a real prospect to achieving a long-term strategy or getting on the right trajectory. I've got one more thing I wanted to say, but does that maybe capture the sort of mood? I think it's the mood more than anything. It's not, I'm not trying to write the minutes. I'm just trying to capture the mood of what you want Barry and David to continue working on. But you have my commitment. The executive is really hot on getting this done. I think today's discussion with Eva's presentation, David's arrival, that's a timely moment to raise the bar. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, I just before a couple of days, in the last couple of days, have received a letter from the environmental transport organisations, our colleagues and friends in the environmental community who contributed so strongly to the strategy paper, wanting to play a bigger role as citizens, civil society, in our work. And I will respond to that letter after this meeting, but I deliberately wanted to get a mandate from the board. I think the mandate from the board is we want to work with stakeholders very, very closely to make this work. So, David, if we can pick that up as well, and we can have a word separately about how I should respond to that very helpful and timely letter. Does that sort of capture the mood of the meeting? Thank you very much indeed. Well, watch this space then, I think, is how we should sum up that. You've given us an agenda, we will take it away and pursue it. I'm now moving to the final item of today's agenda, and we were still slightly ahead of time, but it's nice to reach another important issue while we have time to discuss it. There was a meeting of the Rail North Committee this morning. Liam, sadly, is a little unwell, could not be there to chair, but Andy stood in to chair the meeting. And Andy, I'm just going to ask you to pick up on any important messages from the committee.
Okay, Chair, thank you. I'll be brief because I realise people want to get away. It very much felt like a meeting in a new era. The committee has kind of had to work quite hard to get through some difficult issues over the last couple of years. I think we kind of have obviously made a lot of progress, and the appointment of the operator of last resort was very much the committee's wishes, and it was good finally to be in this changed era. So there's two issues to update on. Firstly, Northern and operator of last resort, and then where we are with TransPennine. A meeting very much was focused around those two issues. On Northern, Richard George and Nick Donovan came to brief us. They are developing a 100-day plan, so they've not kind of gone out there with all of their commitments so far. It's been a bit of a, you know, just take control, but do so in a sort of steady way. But they are doing a 100-day plan, which Richard told the committee he's now looking at both in terms of rolling stock issues, service issues, but also infrastructure too. They're slightly broadening out the kind of scope of what they're looking at. And that is on course to be published in around June this year. So what he did say is that would come back to the committee in May, and we'd be able to have a look at that before it was finalised. This is all linked to the timetable, and we had a debate about the timetable change that's coming in December. The new operator of last resort won't work unless the timetable is refocused. And there is a proposal to remove a Transport for Wales train from the morning and evening peak that is currently going through Oxford Road and Piccadilly. It also happens to be my train, but you know, showing what a team player I am, Chair, I have not objected to this removal. We do need to reduce the number of trains going through central Manchester. It's as simple as that. And this is shaping up now to be a proposal that goes forward. Craig, who's just left, wanted some reassurances around connectivity through Chester and Cheshire East, and those were given. But it was very good. There was a general feeling of, you know, we are now pulling together to try and make this work. I think it was a good discussion. On TransPennine, colleagues might have picked up that at the last meeting it was on the back of an appalling December and early January for TransPennine, where services were way down in terms of punctuality, reliability, and also way up in terms of cancellations linked to the introduction of their new rolling stock and some of the disputes they were having with drivers. And we very much said to them that we wanted a timetable for improvement, which TfN officers have been seeking to turn into a plan, a remedial plan. So it would appear that there had been a slight recovery in January, although February was pretty poor again, and Don, who's left as well, said that North Yorkshire had been particularly hard hit with poor services in February. We went through the issues. Apparently the driver training levels now for TPE linked to the new rolling stock are up to 80%, I think, of drivers trained, whereas they were much lower than that at the turn of the year. They are saying that they are on a slow path towards improvement, and obviously the December timetable change will help them further. Where we got to was we asked them to agree with our officers a mid-year point that they will commit to delivering in terms of PPM and cancellations, and then an end-year point, because it's very important that we apply the same degree of accountability to TPE as we did apply to Northern, and indeed will apply to the new OLR. So that was where the discussion reached. I think the messages to this committee chair is a more positive one than where we've been before. I think there is a prospect of slow improvement of services over the rest of this year. There won't be dramatic improvements, and we do have to manage expectations of the public out there, which we've been trying to do. But I think at least now we have the prospect of being through the worst, be some modest improvements at the two timetable changes this year. The big change will come, the committee was informed, at December 21. That's, I think, scheduled for a much more substantial refocusing of the timetable. And I think that's when you can sort of feel that we'll be back to hopefully a reliable railway. I think until then it's going to be a case of slowish and steady-ish progress back towards that, but new rolling stock coming through all the while. It's not helped, of course, that Richard and colleagues have coronavirus on top of their 100-day plan work, but there's a lot of stoicism in the railway we've learned to see, and I think it's going to test everybody, but I think it was understood, and I think the mood of the committee was that we're going to be there, we're going to be patient and understanding, but we will also be challenging if we need to be. So I hope, Richard, that's a fair summary, but
Thank you. If I could just add to that, thank you, Andy. I think, from our perspective, it was a smooth transfer, which was good. The 100-day plan that Andy's referred to, absolutely right. It was actually something we requested of the Secretary of State. We said we need 100 days to find out what's going on. We need 100 days to open the bonnet, look inside and see what's going on, because otherwise you're going to ask the Secretary of State on day one, what are we doing? Well, we need to understand what's going wrong before we tell you what we do. But what is clear also is that there are a number of issues that are not just within Northern, that we have to work with colleagues in Network Rail and work with colleagues in the DFT to sort out on a system level. And that's really why we come back to it's going to be a couple of years before some of these things change, because we need to change the whole system. So although we're looking, we've taken over control of Northern, actually we can only improve Northern in the context of improving the whole system together. And that's what we're on. That's what we're now setting about doing in a way which I think is a much more holistic, coherent way of getting it done. The other thing, of course, that originally we do in that 100 days is set our budget, because we need to understand what the budget is. And the message I gave to the committee this morning was, unfortunately, we don't come with a money tree attached. And the Treasury's view of railway franchises is the same as the Treasury's view of railway OLR operators, which is you've got that budget, get on with it. So we will end up with some tough decisions, just like performance will end up with some tough decisions, money will end up with some tough decisions too. The other thing I will mention, because it was raised at the committee and will be raised here if I don't raise it anyway, is one of the things that I also thought was a good idea, in addition to the 100 days, was I thought it would be a good idea to invite some people to be an advisory panel to help us to take advice on what we might, the way in which we took Northern forward. I hadn't quite anticipated so many people would want to give me so much advice. And as a consequence, it has become an issue which was entirely the wrong issue. The object of the advisory committee was actually to make sure that we heard voices from people. It turned into a story elsewhere of people we were not listening to, well, which is exactly the opposite of what I was trying to achieve. So what I've said is, look. This has obviously landed wrongly. My fault. I will redress this. I will take this back, revisit it, because actually, you know what? The metropolitan mayors and the metropolitan areas, I'm fairly confident I'm going to hear from them anyway. I need to go and see the metropolitan areas. I need to go and see the mayors. I need to go and see their councils anyway. That's not the issue. I'm frankly much more worried about the non-metropolitan areas, the rural communities, the CBI, the community railways, the disability groups, etc. Those are the people I'm actually more worried about. So actually, I will consult with colleagues, but I will take this back and come back with a slightly revised proposition that actually says, I'm going to come and see the metropolitan mayors anyway. I actually need a committee for the people that I might not otherwise hear.
Thank you. Judith?
I'm really sorry I couldn't be at the meeting this morning. It seemed like a lot of important stuff was covered, so I'm really pleased about that. It just strikes me in terms of moving this forward, we need to go back to the principle of the golden thread and making sure that everything connects to one point. And, bringing in Network Rail is absolutely critical. And we must not ever allow again that sort of fragmentation and that disconnect, if you like, between, the franchise has been let on assumptions that were never ever going to be deliverable, and all of the fallout that came from that. So I really look forward to taking that forward. I understand that you didn't take the Blake Jones review item, which I haven't actually had a chance to have a sit-down one-to-one with Chris Heaton Harris yet. I think he's still got responsibility for that area. It's all been a bit of a shift, you know, for obvious reasons. So I look forward to doing that and getting his authority, if you like, stamped on it to move it all forward. We'll defer that to the next meeting, I think. So, yeah.
Thanks, Chairman. Can I thank Richard for anticipating that some of us may wish to raise this concern anyway, and I look forward to it being addressed in some way. Clearly, I'm from Lancashire, and Lancashire and our two neighbouring unitary authorities and Cumbria to the north don't have any representation at all. That simply can't be right, because we've got commuters with lots of issues, and I take on board what you've just said and look forward to a new way of it being addressed moving forwards.
Can I just add, of course, that all that's happened is the Operator Last Resort has changed the ownership group. All the normal functions and all of the governance arrangements of Rail North Partnership, etc., are all exactly the same as they always were. All we've done is change the remit.
And that is a very important point. Our responsibilities through the Rail Committee remain the same. This is an additional way of reaching out to people to hear messages. Judith?
I just come back. I have to mention that there is still, you know, I understand the performance data, but there is still a lot of concern about the performance of TPE on the east of, particularly on the east of the Pennines. And you know, I just want to get across very strongly that, you know, the jury's still out about the TPE franchise as well.
I think that is well understood, Andy, isn't it?
Absolutely, Chair. So I just want to reassure you, Judith, that there was no holding back again in terms of being firm with TPE. I think just because a decision's been made on Northern, there might be a sense that the pressure's off over. Well, we were very clear today that that is not the case. While we weren't going to set them an arbitrary targets that they couldn't meet, we were very, very clear that we want them to say what they're going to guarantee that they will deliver, or what they say they will, and then we're going to hold them to account. So Gary and the team, I think, are now going to work and put that into a, you know, into a plan, and there is no sense of letting up there. One thing I should say, which I didn't say, Chair, was that there is new leadership at TPE, and Liz Evans? No, have I got that right? Collins, is it? Was there today, replacing Leo Goodwin, and Steve Montgomery is obviously, you know, and that was interesting again and reassuring to have Steve there. So we've got new leadership TPA, and of course at Northern Operator of Last Resort. And just I would want to say it was a good meeting. It was a more honest and open meeting, possibly more constructive maybe than we've had in the past. And you know, though we were being tough with TPE, I think there was a better engagement maybe than we've had in the past. And I just want to say, echoing something you said before, that we do very much have confidence in Richard and Nick and Robin and the team that is there. And you know, I think it was definitely a sense of all of us having drawn a line and moved forward. And I think we needed that. So thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Andy. It's a really encouraging way to end the meeting with a really positive report. Peter H. Golden thread that Judith mentioned. Is there anything you want to say about Network Rail's role in this renaissance or at the timetable changes just before we close?
Well, only to say that our people are fully engaged with Richard's 100-day review. So he's nodding, which is reassuring. And the things that Andy has said about the full timetable change are absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot more focus on getting a reliable timetable change now than there ever has been as a consequence of the last 2 years.
David Hogarth, have we covered everything we should cover on rail operations? Well, I'm sure, Richard, on behalf of the board, we should thank you for taking on this challenge and give you our strong support, and we look forward to steady improvement. Thank you very much. Well, colleagues, we have done well today. We've covered a lot of business. I think we've made some good decisions in the early part of the meeting, which will play into the integrated rail plan for the north of England. It was very good, Jim, to get an update on the important issue of roads that we've not had quite enough time to talk about around this table in recent months for obvious reasons, and then perhaps come back to an issue more important than either of those, which is making sure that we take our environmental responsibilities absolutely seriously and in an integrated way. I normally end these meetings by announcing the next date of the board. It is, of course, in the diary in April, but we will take a rain check on whether it is appropriate to have an open board meeting or whether we should do something like conference call reflecting the sensible plans that Barry has put in place and mentioned at the early part of the meeting. So I won't say make a commitment to that date. All I will say is please, as far as we possibly can, keep safe and healthy, and a good journey home.
John, there's just a point. We're not sure what's going to happen about the local elections and the mayoral elections for obvious reasons. But we will all be in Purda. So that's something we need to just, if the elections
if they go ahead.
carry on.
Yeah.